Hidden tunnels deep underground that helped an American city survive and prosper.
At the time, it was the most expensive construction project in the whole of the US.
A sunken wreck with an extraordinary past, now reclaimed by the sea.
It's as if there's something specific about this area which makes it lethal for shipping.
A concrete dome, once intended to conceal and protect Hitler's wonder weapons.
We have no idea how close we came to losing the war, and this is testament to that fact.
And a mysterious building with eerie echoes of the Cold War.
Massive gaping holes in the ceiling. It looks as though something terrible may have happened here.
Once they were some of the most advanced structures and facilities on the planet, at the cutting edge of design and construction. Today they stand abandoned, contaminated, and sometimes deadly. But who built them and how? And why were they abandoned? Deep in a forest in northern France, there's a strange concrete structure.
It's an extraordinary sight. There's a vast concrete dome nestling in the green farmlands.
I mean, this place is total science fiction. Look at it. There's nothing else like it. And this, the shape of it is just peculiar. Did something plug into that? It's just a strange looking edifice, really.
What you see from outside is that there's some sort of entrance. It looks like something that you would see maybe in a James Bond movie, some, villain's lair.
Hidden inside are dark, cavernous halls carved out of the rock that lead deep underground. Miles of tunnels stretching in every direction disappear into the darkness.
The great steel structures underground supporting this facility. So something of incredible value was happening here. But what was it?
Nobody else had anything like this. These guys were at least 20 years ahead of their time.
So, what is it? And who built it? And why does this building now lie in ruins? The story is rooted in Hitler's change of fortunes during the Second World War, when the Germans were suffering crushing defeats on several fronts.
As the tide started to turn against the Nazis in 1943, Hitler turned to his great new toy box of Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons.
They wanted to do something spectacular, something that would knock the Allies kind of back on their heels. They were desperate for some kind of dramatic knockout punch.
But Allied bombers were doing great damage to Hitler's industrial heartlands.
So he takes the decision to move the most important ones underground, where they're built in subterranean factories.
This is one of those factories, which was built just outside Pas-de-Calais in northern France. It had to be able to withstand the intensive bombing.
This building would have been a source of national pride. This is the complex that was going to win them the war.
Construction began in September 1943. 1,300 workers labored day and night. It was a massive undertaking. As historian Laurent Thierry explains.
The idea was to start with the roof to protect the underground galleries from bombings, so that they could install a launch preparation room deep down. The galleries were to accommodate all the required items for this site: garrison, power generation, and air distribution.
It was like a mini underground town, the ultimate futuristic weapon development center. It was where they would build Hitler's new wonder weapon. But what was it?
These were something that had never been seen before. They came supersonically with no sound and exploded in cities. They took only 5 minutes from launch to impact. This was a whole new kind of warfare.
This is La Coupole, the German V2 missile launch site, codenamed Bovenhaben 21. It was built to produce and fire long-range ballistic missiles, which could hit targets more than 200 miles away. The Germans called it their vengeance weapon, and it was going to be Hitler's way of taking revenge for the Allied bombings of German cities. The V2 was the world's very first long-range guided ballistic missile. It would also become the first man-made object to travel into space. La Coupole was the base for a weapon that was Hitler's last hope of winning the war.
So this, it's a bomb shelter for bombs. This is 55,000 tons of concrete, 15 feet deep. Just below me here is where the rockets were to be launched.
Much of the development was top secret. But what we do know is that once the missiles were assembled, they were transported out to a launch pad and fired.
The V2 rocket was basically designed to instill terror in the populations of anywhere it hit. Flies high up practically to the edge of space and then comes screaming back down faster than the speed of sound, no advance warning, and it delivers this massive explosive charge.
So why did German High Command decide to build the complex here? La Coupole was just 45 kilometers from the coast of northern France, and the perfect location to attack its primary target, London.
Hitler wanted the La Coupole facility to be able to send V2 rockets against London at a rate of dozens a day. This meant a site that could store hundreds of rockets and produce them around the clock.
All of the missile components were to be stored in a vast network of underground tunnels before going to the very heart of the operation for assembly.
The construction zone is built on a vertical hierarchy, so that at every level there would be specialists adding additional elements to the V2 as it went through the construction process.
But the Germans hadn't been completely successful in keeping La Coupole's location a secret. And in March 1944, the first Allied bombs rained down on the concrete dome. The complex had yet to launch a single missile. But it was already a target for the Allies' very own superweapon. It was an earthquake bomb called Tall Boy. Each Tall Boy bomb weighed 6 tons. It was specifically designed to destroy massive hardened targets against which conventional bombs were useless.
There will be a total of about 20 raids on the site until July 1944. The British will drop 3,000 tons of bombs onto the site, including 32 tallboy bombs during 2 operations.
One bomb landed right beside the dome, burying the entrances to 2 of the tunnels. All construction was stopped, and the site was never completed. La Coupole was finally abandoned at the end of July 1944. Today, the site is a ruin.
We have no idea how close we came to losing the war. And this is testament to that fact. If the Germans had another year, this would have been complete. Would have been pumping out 50 missiles a day. Don't forget the UK is 5 minutes away. Fortunately for us, time was not on their side.
"45 kilometers from Germany's capital, Berlin, lies a building that looks almost palatial.
There's so few places in Europe that seem to still have the dust lying on them in thick layers. So few places where you can see untouched history.
It seems to be perfectly preserved, until you take a closer look.
Plaster is peeling from walls. There's an overriding air of neglect that just permeates the place.
Mummified animals stretch out on a carpet, their final resting place. Their faces are a picture of death. Everywhere, there is a sense of quiet despair. There's a theater. The seats are turned towards an empty stage. And a swimming pool, which last saw water long ago. And that's not all. In one of the rooms, there's a painted mural complete with Russian writing.
There's a statue of the former communist leader Lenin standing defiantly in front of the building. But this is Germany. What is the connection with the Soviet Union? Nearby are several smaller buildings, which are even more dilapidated. The remaining window panes are smeared with grime, and vegetation is growing through cracks in the floor, and there's massive gaping holes in the ceiling. It looks as though something terrible may have happened here.
You have to ask yourself what happened to the kind of power that could create so much impact so recently and to have disappeared so completely.
Who lived in these buildings? What were they used for? And how were they connected to a covert spying operation by the CIA? For the reasons, we need to look back to the hostility that existed between the East and the West during the Cold War.
After the Second World War, we, the Allies, were determined that we would never allow Germany to threaten the world again. And so we divided Germany up and we occupied it.
That decision was made at the famous Potsdam Conference, which was held at the home of Crown Prince Wilhelm in Potsdam during the summer of 1945. It began just 9 weeks after Germany's surrender. This was where Winston Churchill, Harry S. Truman, and Joseph Stalin met to determine how beaten Germany should be administered. It was decided that West Germany should be occupied by the Americans, the British, and the French, and East Germany by the Soviet Union, which immediately began to fortify its border with the West.
Political and ideological tensions soon escalated between the Soviet Union and the West. And East Germany is on the fault line. It was the Iron Curtain.
Because of its strategic importance, the Soviet Union needed to maintain a military presence here in East Germany.
Firstly, to ensure there was an effective fighting force capable of taking on NATO. And secondly, to ensure that East Germany towed the Moscow party line.
Powerful and highly mobile communist forces in Eastern Europe number over 500,000 men. Well-trained and well-equipped, they pose a continuing security threat to all of Europe.
350,000 of those troops were stationed here in East Germany. The Western Group of Forces, as it became known, was the largest army on foreign soil.
It was equipped with the latest of the Soviet military equipment, because if things got down and dirty and it came to conflict, these extremely well-equipped troops would be the ones to confront NATO.
It's hard to imagine now, but this was once Red Army headquarters. The command and control center for all operations in East Germany and beyond. But why build it here at Wunsdorf, a small town 40 kilometers from Berlin? The town has been associated with the military since the late 19th century. When the Nazis came to power, Wunsdorf was HQ for the German armed forces. And once the war ended, the Red Army moved in, as caretaker Jürgen Neumann explains.
The military properties of the former Wehrmacht were still in superb condition. You didn't have to build new, you just had to move in, make some modifications, and I guess that's why here, near Potsdam, near Berlin, the High Command was stationed.
According to top-secret CIA reports, it was where indoctrinated German officers would come on political assignments, and high-ranking Soviet officers discussed the probability of war with the West. But first of all, the Soviets had to deal with problems a little closer to home.
There was a strike by construction workers in East Berlin, which turned into a widespread revolt against the government. But the Soviets couldn't allow their authority to be undermined, so they send in the tanks.
People with rocks aren't very effective against tanks, and of course the East German resistance is crushed. Now they know they're living in a totalitarian state.
The Red Army was in Germany to control Germans and confront the West. When those Germans got out of line, the Red Army did not hesitate to destroy them.
But in a military headquarters, why are there so many non-military facilities?
It wasn't just the armed forces who lived there, but their families as well.
In the main building, there were exhibitions, memorial rooms, and there were small cinema rooms where propaganda films were shown. A lot of history about the Second World War, in particular about the glorious Soviet army.
The Red Army officers and their families who served in Germany were able to enjoy a high standard of life that was a lot like what they would have had back in the Soviet Union, but even better.
To the 75,000 men, women, and children who lived here, it was Little Moscow. On November the 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. And Germany was no longer willing to allow an occupying army on its soil.
The huge Soviet infrastructure in East Germany was enormously expensive to maintain. And as the Soviet state collapsed at home, the Soviet presence in Germany had to be pulled back.
It was only a matter of time before the Russian troops would be called back home. And so, after a final military parade on June the 25th, 1994, the Red Army left for good. Today, the former Red Army HQ is up for sale, but it still stands as a monument to a fallen regime.
For so many years, Germany was about to be destroyed by a great cataclysm. And the scars of that on Germany are still seen. All over Germany, we see relics of the enormous occupying powers who invested so much in Germany and for so long. "30 kilometers off Marlin Head, on the northernmost tip of Ireland, is a strange and confusing sight. "60 meters beneath the surface of the dark waters of the Atlantic is a jumble of tangled metal.
Deep within the murky depths, shapes slowly emerge. And you start to get a sense of what's going on here. There's a propeller, there's a hull, there's a mass of rusty metal. This is the grave of a sunken ship.
Other shapes make little sense on a boat. There appear to be guns, tracks, turrets. As you look more closely, it becomes clear that these are tanks, but there's no explanation why tanks which should be on land are on the seabed.
What's even more surprising is that these aren't British models, but American Sherman tanks.
Dozens of them. It almost looks as though they're ready to go into battle.
The whole seabed area around there is actually a nautical graveyard. There are ocean liners, there are submarines. It's as if there's something specific about this area which makes it lethal for shipping.
What happened to this ship? Why was it carrying American tanks? And how did it end up at the bottom of the ocean? One of the most costly campaigns of the Second World War holds the key to the reasons why. It was the Battle of the Atlantic.
During World War II, as an island, Great Britain was fundamentally dependent on its allies for supplies. The main supply line came across the Atlantic from the United States and Canada. In fact, it wasn't just a supply line, it was a lifeline. The Atlantic Passage is the most important way in which Britain got its materials to defend itself during the war. Hitler knew that one of the easiest ways to hit the United Kingdom hard was to cut off that all-important supply route.
So Hitler made it a priority to sink merchant shipping sailing across the Atlantic. He knew that if he could starve Britain and isolate her from her allies, he would force her out of the war. But what connection did that have to a sunken ship laden with American tanks lying on the seabed? This is the wreck of the SS Empire Heritage. She started life as a whaler, but she'd been damaged by a mine and put out of service in 1941. But that wasn't the end of her story.
The SS Empire Heritage was by no means the cream of the merchant fleet, but all boats were needed, so it was patched up and put into service between Liverpool and New York.
Each time the ship made the crossing to and from Liverpool, she had to pass Marlin Head. It was one of the most dangerous parts of the crossing, according to Jeff Miller, who has often dived the wreck.
Yeah, Marlin Head can be a very treacherous stretch of water. There's very strong tides, and we're open to the full force of the Atlantic Ocean. The next stop off Marlin Head is America, which is thousands of miles away, so we've all that rough energy coming in from the ocean. Just waves, constant seas and storms.
The SS Empire Heritage was part of a massive convoy of almost 100 ships that left New York in August 1944. It was heading towards Liverpool with a heavy cargo of war supplies, including 16,000 tons of oil and almost 2,000 tons of deck cargo, which included Sherman tanks.
To counter the threat of the German U-boats, the Royal Navy came up with a system of convoys. And the idea was that up to 30 or 70 merchant ships would sail under protective guard of Royal Navy vessels.
It was almost 3 months after D-Day, and the Allies were well on their way to winning the war. The fighting after the landings on the beaches in Normandy was fierce. The Villa Bocage area, with its fields and hedgerows and sunken lanes, was almost tailor-made for the German defenders, and casualties among the Allied infantry units were high. But after 3 months of bitter combat, the Germans were eventually forced into full retreat. However, there was still an urgent need for supplies.
Although beachheads had been established in Normandy, what was now required was intense effort to push all the way through France and down into Germany. And to do that, a lot of equipment was necessary.
The Allies cannot ship war materials, troops, and supplies effectively to major continental ports. It's months after D-Day that they have large, capable ports operating under Allied control. Until virtually the end of 1944, Britain is still the great essential logistics base.
It took several days for the SS Empire Heritage to reach the north coast of Ireland. She was on the home straight.
Although not complacent, there was a definite feeling that the battle in the Atlantic was over. In effect, it had calmed down from 1943, and with the success of D-Day, there was a sense that shipping in the Atlantic was freer than formerly it had been.
She was just 30 kilometers from Marlin Head when disaster struck. A German U-boat, lurking beneath the waves, had the SS Empire Heritage in its sights. The U-boat was one of Hitler's most deadly weapons. And this particular one was fitted with the very latest technology.
It had a snorkel, so it could stay submerged for much longer. It hardly needed to surface, so it was very hard to spot. It was also armed with the very latest torpedoes, acoustic torpedoes, which could hone in on the sound of a propeller.
2 of those torpedoes smashed into the SS Empire Heritage.
2 torpedoes might not sink a battleship, which is heavily armored. Merchant ships aren't armored. It's going to sink. This is a case where this particular vessel got very, very unlucky.
The Empire Heritage was carrying 16,000 tons of petrol. So when the torpedo struck that, you can imagine the fireball that would have caused, and the sea would have been in flames. I mean, diving in the oil filled with water, just in flames, and must have been horrendous, must have been a horrible death. I think there was approximately 70,000 merchant seamen lost their lives in World War II. Just unimaginable horror.
When the SS Empire Heritage went down, over 100 of the sailors on board died, and many, of course, were very young, even in their teens. This was a sinking with a very real human cost.
The SS Empire Heritage and her cargo lay deep beneath the waves until 1995, when she was rediscovered by divers.
It's a underwater monument to the valor of tens of thousands of merchant seamen in World War II who made victory possible. Victory would not have been possible without all of those ships bringing the supplies, bringing the men, bringing the material to Britain, bringing the soldiers to Britain. And because of their sacrifice, the Allies win the war.
In Westchester County, which lies 64 kilometers from New York City, is the most extraordinary sight.
You're walking along this simple trail through the woods, and there you see this strange stone tower. It's round, doesn't have any doors or windows. It's very mysterious. I mean, who built it? What's it doing here? What's it connected to?
These brick monoliths, scarred by graffiti, dominate the landscape as if they are guarding a long-lost secret. And that's not all. There's a rectangular stone structure that seems completely out of place in this urban setting.
If you went inside, you'd see wheels, you'd see levers, you'd even see what looks like a bit of a gate, which is operated by pulleys. But they're rusted and they're corroded, so you can tell by looking at it that they haven't been used in a long time.
Hidden beneath is something more eerie. It's a tunnel, partially filled with water, that seems to be unfinished.
You see that the tunnels aren't brick-lined all the way around. In many instances, they're just almost like half-lined, and then as you look above, you can see that it's just the raw rock, almost like they left it as it was excavating.
This tunnel stretches into the darkness and seems to go on forever. But where does it go? At the end of the tunnel, there's a clue.
Water thunders down this stepped slope, and above it, this imposing steel arch that stretches right across a gorge. But how are all these things connected?
In the early 19th century, New York City was facing several problems. Even back then, New York was already the biggest city in the United States and its business and economic hub.
Problem that you have with New World cities like New York, cities that spring up and then rapidly develop, is that very quickly they use the local water system around them, the streams and the rivers that are there. We need water to live, and if you can't supply that, that's a major problem.
As the population of New York increased rapidly, the water supply became polluted and diseases began to spread. One was cholera, and an epidemic ravaged the city in 1832. The disease struck fear into the hearts of New Yorkers. It seemed to attack randomly and at frightening speed. Apparently healthy people would leave their houses in the morning, contract the disease, and be dead by nightfall. More than half of those infected did not survive.
These diseases were a huge concern for people, even in very sophisticated, rich urban areas like London or New York. Epidemics would spread, and they were absolutely terrifying.
And disease wasn't the only problem. 3 years after the cholera epidemic, a great fire destroyed almost 700 buildings, which lay at the very heart of the city's commercial center.
Buildings were made of wood. They were very close together. So if one house caught on fire, boom, half your city is up in flames in minutes.
So New York needed water, and lots of it. The question was, where would the vast quantities it required come from? And how would they get it into the city?
The local authorities decided to build an aqueduct. If they pulled it off, it would be one of the most spectacular feats of engineering ever seen.
The plan was to dam the Croton River, some 64 kilometers north of Manhattan, and build a channel to bring that water into the city. It was one of the most ambitious construction projects ever attempted.
The old Croton Aqueduct was a mega project. And to get this channel of water all the way into Manhattan was really aggressive for the technology of the day.
So how would it work?
The aqueduct would use the Earth's gravity to move the water from the reservoir to the city along a gradual gradient or slope. And the challenge for its builders was to maintain this gradual slope across a variety of terrain.
You've got to go over valleys, you've got to go through hills, through rock, and all the way from source to the delivery point, you have to maintain or very close to that gradient.
Not only that, the aqueduct had to be built in sections along its entire route. Each one, like this bridge, was a major engineering project in itself. If these sections didn't connect properly, the water wouldn't be able to reach the city. Writer and broadcaster Jim Meigs explains the challenges its builders faced.
The aqueduct was really built by hand, by human and animal muscle power. Everything had to be excavated by hand, hauled away by animals, and ultimately constructed to carry all this water without any modern equipment. But in some places, they had to get through a hill, and that meant tunneling through solid rock. And that's what we see in this section here. They came in with hand drills that they would drive into the rock. You can actually see the tracks of the old drill bits in a couple of spots here. Then they would stuff those holes with black powder, blow them off, and that would fracture the rock. This was incredibly difficult, dangerous work. There was the threat of cave-ins. They were operating with explosive black powder. There were all kinds of things that could go wrong.
The engineers were also worried about a buildup of toxic air within the aqueduct that might contaminate the water supply. So they built ventilation shafts into the tunnel. There are 21 of these still standing.
These serve a number of purposes. First of all, they allow air to circulate through the tunnels so you don't get pressure buildup in key parts of the system. They also allow the water to aerate in some way. It keeps the water fresh, if you will. But they also served as access points. So every third or fourth ventilation shaft was also used as an access point into the tunnel system.
But construction was beset by problems. In early 1841, part of the dam collapsed, the valley was flooded, and 3 people were killed. Then, its mainly Irish workforce went on strike in protest at their wages being cut.
You have to remember, when this project was being built, everything was done by hand labor. They required an army of laborers, many of them Irish, who labored in this absolutely, brutal task for several years to get this huge piece of engineering completed.
When the aqueduct crossed a valley, the workers had to move thousands of tons of soil and rock in hand carts in order to build an embankment to protect it. And at its base, they built a culvert, as Mavis Kane from Friends of Old Croton explains.
And it was built to protect the aqueduct from the thrust of water from the many, many streams and rivers that there are in Westchester. So the culvert serves as a way of keeping the water from weakening the stones of the aqueduct. Wherever there is a stream strong enough to cause damage, there is a culvert.
The aqueduct took 5 years to build and cost the then enormous sum of $13 million.
And at the time, it was the most expensive construction project in the whole of the US.
So, would the various sections join together and allow the water to flow those 64 long kilometers to New York? On June the 22nd, 1842, they were going to find out.
The aqueduct was an absolute overnight, immediate success. Without the aqueduct, they wouldn't have been able to expand the city the way they did.
So I'm standing right in the main channel of the aqueduct. This is where the water flowed. On a normal day, it might be up to my knees or maybe up to my waist. And behind me, you can see this big iron gate that they would use to close off the flow if they ever needed to empty the lower portions of the aqueduct.
If the aqueduct was such a success, why was it abandoned? By the early 1880s, some 40 years after it was completed, the aqueduct was no longer able to meet the city's needs.
In a sense, the aqueduct was a victim of its own success. It was such a boon to the city that it allowed New York to continue growing at this dramatic pace, and the population of the city was going up. Pretty soon, they were using up all the water from the Old Croton Aqueduct.
In 1885, they began to build a new aqueduct on top of the old dam and reservoir. To save it from being forgotten forever, the Old Croton Aqueduct is now preserved, a unique part of New York's remarkable industrial heritage.
You can see some of the hidden gems that are there, the chimneys, the air ventilation systems. As nature overgrows and as we don't follow these paths very often, then they'll become more and more hidden.
Now they lie abandoned, but once they were at the cutting edge of engineering. There are echoes from history in these decaying structures. They remind us of terror and war, but also of great innovation and human endeavor.